Hello, I'm Brigantia, Blackbird of Blackbird's Brew. Happy Saturday, and welcome to the last regularly scheduled Loki video. If you caught my Pagan Problems video of last Tuesday, you'll be aware that I discussed that Loki is wanting to do a bit more one-on work with me, and that the focus isn't currently about mounting a public defense for him. And so videos about Loki will be occurring as I feel inspired and as I feel nudged to do so. One chapter has ended and another beckons. It's very exciting. There's so much that I have said about Loki and what I've learned from him thus far, and I wondered how I would sum all of that up, or what I would choose as my main takeaway that I would like to leave the viewers with, at least for the time being. It really is an embarrassment of riches. I feel like I've only just begun to scratch the surface on what the myths about him can teach and the different ways of looking at the stories and how to interpret them. And one of my takeaways from the myths as a whole is that everyone in the stories has their reasons for doing what they're doing, even if it isn't immediately apparent on the first reading. If you dig a bit deeper and you think about it, you can find either an overt or a highly probable motivation for every single action. And sometimes understanding that can radically alter your perceptions of the myths and of the gods themselves. These aren't one-dimensional characters, and the myths cannot be read the way you would read a comic book with a clear line between these are the good guys and these are the baddies. It's more complicated than that, and it's a reminder to us that our daily lives are more complicated than that. So of course anything going on at the divine level would also be more complicated. And what's very clear in my mind is that Loki teaches us about actions and consequences, that behavior, particularly behaviors that go on long enough to become patterns, are like seeds planted in a field. Sooner or later, if you leave them in the ground, those seeds will sprout and they will come to fruition. It's an inevitable process, and it's not to be thwarted by any kind of power or any being. It's just the way the universe functions. Our task is to accept that. And what do we see in the stories of Loki and his interactions with the rest of the gods? What we see is a pattern of mutual alienation, of Loki literally contorting himself to suit the gods' purposes and over-sacrificing for their benefit and not getting any respect or gratitude for it. The gods acting out of fear regarding Loki's children with Agraboda, which created the very problems they feared instead of preventing them. And then we see when Loki was angry and delivering a few home truths about the other gods to their faces, they became defensive, as you might expect, and their response was to punish the messenger rather than consider if the message had merit. And of course, after all of this and after Loki's binding in the cave, the end result was open, total warfare and mutually assured destruction. Now, there is room to criticize the behavior of everyone involved in every event that led up to the final showdown, and I think that's the point. I think that's why these stories have continued to survive. The gods are trying to teach us that we can create untenable situations in our own lives, and if we act foolishly, without wisdom, and we can actively destroy relationships, we can actively destroy pathways to reconciliation, and we are therefore sowing the seeds of our own destruction. We have to make choices not to do that if we want a different outcome. And I think when the gods were younger, they had to learn these lessons the hard way. There was a terrible personal cost to each of them as they went through this process. And when we think of the myths, after Ragnarok has taken place, the smoke is cleared, there comes an ending that is a recreation of the worlds. There's a sense of starting over. And I think the reason why that's included is because the gods are communicating that they learned how to begin again. And they learned from past mistakes. And the preservation of the stories has been the gods communicating with us to recognize our own destructive patterns and to learn how to make better choices, at least for ourselves. I mean, obviously we can't control what others do, but we can take hold of ourselves. And from the very beginning of my interactions with Loki, he has returned again and again to this process of cause and effect and how it must take place. It is a fundamental reality of the universe. He has shown me that chaos and order are inseparable concepts. They are linked, and each leads to the other in a cycle. They both invigorate and stabilize the other, and both can destroy the other when it becomes too extreme. I think this is really why he keeps nudging me not to think too literally about the myths, but to concentrate on symbolism. What is the lesson of each story? What impulse is at the root of the conflict? He has been incredibly generous with these nudges as I've, gone through my own thinking process. And as a deity, I've really been struck by Loki's patience and his push for me to get acquainted with the rest of the gods. Even though he takes the primary claim on me, he still wants me to know them as a whole. He has a desire for me to get a working understanding of how the big picture all fits together. Loki has helped me to stop fighting things, at least not as much as I once did, but to stop fighting things that can't be changed, but to learn to adapt to the changing landscape, to become psychologically divorced from visions of what I think ought to be, so I can focus on what actually is and why it is and what's possible now and what's the most effective way to get there. This has been monumentally helpful because I'm not wasting as much energy on useless goals and on illusions. I can harness all the energy that would have been going to foolishness much more productively. And another thing that I can't emphasize enough is the importance that Loki puts onto family relationships and the value of marriage. Never does a day go by without a meditation in which this doesn't come up in some form or another. And when we think about it, what set Loki against the other gods in the myths more than anything else was the treatment of his children and his wives. When you look at the stories from the perspective of an outraged father and husband who is seeking retribution over the harm done to his family, it puts a much different complexion on the myths. For all of his wildness and his ability to transform, it's clear where Loki's heart is and where he expects the heart of his devotees to be. Now, speaking of his shape-shifting ability, his myths illustrate that no matter how he chooses to disguise himself, for whatever strategic reason, the core reality of who he is remains, and the moments it's no longer necessary to be disguised, he always reverts to the truth of who he is. I bring up this point because far too many people try to rationalize their own opinions about sexuality and gender identity by projecting those views onto Loki and saying that his mythos proves their views. This is a misrepresentation, and it is a misunderstanding of the stories, and honestly of Loki himself. Those who hold these mistaken views are ignoring the reasons for why Loki sometimes took on radically different forms from his own. It was a matter of strategic necessity, and not an indicator of any fluidity of his sex or his sexuality. Now, one of the surprises of working with Loki has been how optimistic he is. Every setback to him is just a temporary state of affairs to be overcome. One of the memes I found early on referencing Loki states, improvise, adapt, overcome. And that mantra has been drilled into me. For once, a pagan meme that I found actually got something right. I mean, how about that? But this isn't about the stubborn pursuit of bad ideas, but it is about having the grit to do what it takes to follow through with good ideas and having the wisdom to discern the difference between the two. Because again, Loki is always looking at that cause and effect, action and consequence. Add the results of things into your calculations. This is a push against the narrative of our society that's constantly focusing on alleged good intentions and absolutely lambasting anyone who looks at the results of those intentions once they were put into practice, and suggest that perhaps this is an indication that the original idea wasn't the greatest thing ever. Now, because this gets attacked so often, what it actually is, it's not just an attack on the people who are bringing up some salient points. It's an attack on a human being's means of survival. We survive because we learn from experience and we learn to make judgments about what helps us and what is detrimental to us. It does matter to have that principle of cause and effect firmly rooted within the soul. Now, lastly, I want to express my profound gratitude for Loki coming into my life at all. There is a massive difference from where I was last October and where I'm at today. There has been growth. I am better off. And best of all, this will continue. Not as publicly, at least not for a season, but the work goes on. It's an incredible privilege for a deity, but especially a deity that's as important as Loki, to take such a personal interest and to provide that guidance and to have, what feels like an overarching plan of I need to get you where you need to go, and this is important, and I see something in you. And I hope I don't take that for granted, and I hope that the fruits of this relationship continue to manifest and that it becomes visible to outside observers. That's the true test, I think, and it's really exciting to be watching on that path. And if you're watching this, I'm so excited that you've chosen to be a part of this journey. So we'll see what twists and turns come into the future, and we'll just see how things go. In the meantime, if you are a fellow Loki devotee, I would love to hear about your own experiences. Tell me about it in the comments. Although, really, if I'm being honest, the best place to have these conversations and to swap stories and experiences and kind of talk about what we've learned along the way, that really is much better to do at the Gilded group. There's a link to join us in the description box below. Our server is called Blackbird's Brew. It allows for real-time back and forth conversation. It's so much better than leaving a comment. Maybe someone sees it, maybe they don't, and maybe they reply. And it's just, it takes a lot of the time lag and the complication just out of the equation, and it allows for a true exchange. All part of community building, so I hope you do decide to make yourself a part of that. But that'll do it for this video, and I will see you next time. Bye.